Hello everyone. So today you are going to be taking notes from this slideshow on page 6 of your biome project packet. So I'll give you a second to get there. And it is stage C part 1. So throughout this video I'm going to just basically be filling in some information on your packet. So please feel free to pause whenever you need and whenever you need a second to catch up. That is what the purpose of this video is. So I'll give you a second. You can pause the video now if you still need some time. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and move on. So before we begin with the cycles, I want to first talk about where does this matter come from. And there are 4 main elements that are going to contribute to the huge parts of our cycles of matter. And that is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And these 4 elements go into things like water, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And those are 4 things that we really need in order for life to exist here on Earth. So here is an overview of the 4 different types of processes that we have here on Earth. So for example, we have the biological processes. An example of this is eating and breathing. We also have the geological processes, which an example of those are eruptions and erosions. We have chemical and physical processes, which is precipitation and water flow, as well as human activity, which looks like farming, mining, and fertilizer. So this is just an overview, and we're going to go into the definitions, starting with the biogeochemical cycle. And this is when elements pass from one organism to another among parts of the biosphere through closed loops. So it uses all of those 4 cycles that we just went over, the 4 processes: biological, geological, chemical, and human activity, and all of those processes together make up the biogeochemical cycles, which makes sense since it has the word bio, geo, and chem in the title. So it incorporates all of those cycles. To start defining, we're going to go ahead and get started with the biogeochemical cycle, and that is any and all activities performed by living organisms. So for example, every single time we breathe, we eat, anytime we're burning food, so that's like moving and any sort of athletic exercise, and anytime that we eliminate waste products. Those are all examples of the biological processes. So go ahead, if you need to, you can pause the video to write that down. Otherwise, I will keep going. Similarly, the geological processes is any time that a major movement of matter within and below the Earth's surface of the Earth occur. So for example, anytime there are volcanic eruptions or the formation and breakdown of rock, that falls under the geological process. Chemical and physical processes also include the formation of clouds and precipitation, the flow of running water, and the action of lightning. And so this one kind of combines the chemical and physical aspects, the physical aspects being the formation of clouds, precipitation, flow of running water, and the action of lightning would fall under that chemical process because that is a chemical reaction. We also have something called human activity, and this is whenever any type of human activity that affects cycles of matter on a global scale. So for example, we have mining and burning fossil fuel, clearing of land for building and farming, since that affects a lot of animals that have previously been in that location, how that affects them to have to move and find a different place to live or die out altogether. Same thing with burning a forest. That also can create a disruption in terms of their habitat and would cause some organisms to either deplete or to have to move again. And as well, or also manufacture and use of fertilizers. So those are some examples of human activity that affect cycles of matter in a big, big way. So if you needed to go ahead and pause, feel free to do that. And when you're ready, you can hit the play button, and we're going to get into our first cycle called the water cycle. So the water cycle is the one that we're probably most familiar with. I believe that you've been learning this through elementary school. I know we do it in 6th grade and so forth. But the main part of the water cycle is this idea that water flows between the oceans. They evaporate to the atmosphere. Then it falls as precipitation back onto land, where the cycle continues. So what we're going to write in the processes box is evaporation and how water leaves oceans in forms of water vapor or a gas. We also have transpiration, which is different than evaporation because it's when water is leaving the plant's leaves. So that could be any sort of plant, any sort of tree, any primary producer. Transpiration is specific to that. We also have precipitation, which is when water vapor returns to Earth. There's 4 different types of precipitation that we see. That could be rain, sleet, hail, and snow are the 4 most common that we tend to see. And when it hits the land, it all kind of pulls together and turns into this runoff, which is whenever there's water on the surface. And the runoff can either flow into streams, it can flow into rivers, which then goes to lakes, which then tends to go to oceans as well. And then some of that water that gets absorbed into the soil is called groundwater. And then depending on how much water gets infiltrated through, which if you take a look at our video, or excuse me, at our picture, we see that infiltration happens whenever water goes through the ground, through several layers into this water reservoir that we usually call an aquifer if it's drinking water. But you can take a look at this picture. We have evaporation from our big bodies of water that then condensate into our cloud, and then that falls down as rain or some sort of precipitation, which then causes this runoff. So you can see that it comes from the mountains. Often gravity is the due to this. And then it comes back into our body of water, and then we've got our transpiration that comes off of the plants. So go ahead and pause the video. You are going to be writing down the significance of the water cycle and how it's important to preserving life on Earth. So you're going to use your own reasoning and your own words to answer this question. So go ahead and pause the video for as long as you need, and then you can press play when you are ready to move on. So the next set of cycles, we call these our nutrient cycles, and that's because these nutrients are chemical substances that we need for life. So the first one we're going to talk about is the carbon cycle. So you can write this down in the processes column where it says carbon is a major element in all organic compounds, and so that is what you're going to be writing down in the first box. Examples of this are carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. They all exist in the carbon cycle, as well as nucleic acids. You're going to write this down in the sources category. So carbon cycle, it can be found in the atmosphere as CO2 gas, in the ocean as dissolved carbon dioxide, and on land in organisms, soil, and rocks, and finally underground as coal, oil, and natural gas. So those are all ways that we can find carbon cycle. And so here's a picture of the carbon cycle. We can see that the auto and factory emissions contribute to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Then that gets taken in by plants through photosynthesis as well as sunlight, and then that can be given off as organic carbon. So when decaying organisms or dead organisms and waste products get a lot of pressure and over a lot of time, they turn into fossils and fossil fuels. Otherwise, that can get taken up by root respiration, and then the plant respiration gives off that carbon back up into the atmosphere. And here's another example, just a little bit more detail that connects things more. So if you'd like to pause, you can right now. So you are again going to be writing down the significance of the carbon cycle. So go ahead and pause the video, write down why this cycle is important to preserving life on Earth. How do we use it? Using your own words and reasoning. So go ahead and pause now. Our next cycle is the nitrogen cycle, and the significance of the nitrogen cycle, and you're going to write this down in your square, is that nitrogen is needed to make amino acids or proteins and nucleic acids, which make up our DNA and RNA, which we will talk more about later this year. The sources you're going to find for the nitrogen cycle is in nitrogen gas, which makes up 78% of the atmosphere, and it's also found in soil, decaying matter, wastes, and oceans. So these 5 places are the sources for your nitrogen cycle. The processes, so this is going to be the first box, you're going to write down that there's something called nitrogen fixation, which is when bacteria can convert nitrogen gas into substances that plant can use. So they kind of give back to the soil, and this is what the roots pick up for their nutrients. There's also a process called denitrification, or denitrification, excuse me, where there's some bacteria that convert nitrates into nitrogen gas. So then it goes back into gas. And here is a picture of the nitrogen cycle. So one of the things that you may notice is that the nitrogen cycle, a lot of it happens underground, whereas the water cycle and the carbon cycle mostly happened above ground. So this is where a lot of our organisms get their nutrients. This is where a lot of the plants pick up those nutrients from the soil, and this is when decomposers and detritivores are really important to our cycles. And here's another more clear picture. If you want to pause, you can take a closer look. Our next and last cycle is the phosphorus cycle. So let's start with the significance again. Phosphorus is needed to make nucleic acids, which make up our DNA and RNA, which we'll talk again later on this year. And we also have some sources. So phosphate is usually found on land in either rocks and soil, and then sometimes when that gets brushed off into the ocean, that's where the phosphorus gets found, so in oceans. So the process that phosphorus undergoes is that it's released by erosion into the soil where plants take it up and eventually pass it on to consumers. And so that's where we get a lot of our phosphate, is when we eat, the organisms that eat it before that and through the whole entire food chain. So that's where we get a lot of our phosphorus. So if you take a look at the diagram, we have phosphate that is in rocks, and then through erosion they can fall into this little lake here, which is what the algae will take up through the dissolved phosphates, which the animals will eat, and so forth. So that's how the phosphorus kind of gets uptaken through for us. So go ahead and pause the video and take a look at this picture a little bit closer. So this isn't part of your notes, but it is also important to include this idea of nutrient limitation. So you don't have to take any notes for this, but this may help you for your next section in part 2. If you want to take a look and pause the video and look ahead, this may help you answer some of those questions. So plants need nutrients to grow and produce organic material. So that's basically the need of nutrients through plants. And this can be limited if a nutrient is not available. So depending on the shortage, it could affect our plants. So we use fertilizers to replace those missing nutrients, and that's what we have a lot of. But however, the runoff from fertilizer can create algal blooms, which is when we have a lot of algae in one place. And then where is the oxygen in all of these cycles? Isn't it important too? Oxygen is prevalent in every single cycle. We saw it in carbon dioxide. We can see it in nitrogen and nitrous oxide. And we also see it in calcium carbonate. Okay, so these are a couple of ways that we see oxygen in all of these cycles. So that is your notes. So when you are done, you're going to go ahead and go on to part 2 and part 3 in your packet and answer those questions using this lecture, your notes, or the book to follow on, and that's what you're going to be working on today.